Hello then, good morning everyone. I hope you can see the screen today. I just wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, which is part of the 1921 Census Project. And today's title is Jewish Sussex in 1921. And through Dr Diana Wilkins, who's here with us, we're going to be looking at research, resources and case studies, exploring the lives of Jewish people across Sussex through the lens of the 1921 census. So here we have an image below of the Dudkin family who are going to be coming up a bit later this morning, and also Osmond Davidor Goldsmith, who lived in Hove and was the president of the Anglo-Jewish Association at exactly this point in time, 1921 to 1926. I'm just going to talk for about sort of 5 to 8 minutes myself, and then I'm going to hand over to Diana, who's going to talk to you for about an hour, and then we're going to have a 10-minute break before we talk about the second part of the activities. And eventually at the end, the last 15 minutes, we're going to have a questions and answer session. So we won't be taking questions as we go, but if you want to put them in the chat, what I will do is I will collate those and then we can present them all at the end, along with sort of various links and useful items for you to explore further if you have Jewish family or an interest in particular research and genealogy. So do pop your questions in the chat and do let me know. All okay, that's fantastic. So I just wanted to say then, just a quick bit about myself. So I'm Nicola Benge, and I'm the director of one of the directors of Striker Light Arts and Heritage, which is a community interest company based in Brighton, but we work across Sussex and occasionally the South East and London too. We've been in operation since 2010, and we are unique in the sense that we find creative ways to work with heritage through life stories, project themes, and local memories with different kinds of audiences. We offer projects, training, workshops, and courses on a variety of subjects. And I will pop a link to the work that we do in the chat slightly later. So just moving on then, one of the things that we have worked on, let me just sorry, my screen's frozen. Here we go. Fantastic. So one of the things that we have done previously is a project called Shalom Sussex, which is how we came to be working with Diana Wilkins as our research coordinator. And this was looking at the history of Jewish people in Sussex through the lens of the First World War and the contribution Jewish people made across the First World War in the battlefield, but also at home on the home front. Being such a small part of the Sussex demographic, but we wanted to really kind of explore that sort of hidden history. So this was a great project to work on, and again, I'll pop the link to that in the chat shortly. We looked at lots of different themes, and we looked at lots of different people, some of whom will be coming up again in the talk with Diana shortly. So just to really quickly sort of explore this. So following our project last year, which explored the 1911 census, we've partnered once more with the University of Brighton Centre for Memory, Narrative and Histories to deliver a series of these workshops, training and activities all around the theme of the 1921 census. So we'll be delivering events and activities until July 22, and they'll all be free. Some are webinars, some are in person, and some are, you know, sort of through research groups as well. So we'll be using the National Archives, which these images have come from, as they have lots of information about the 1921 census. But just to move on quickly, what they have done is they've outsourced their research and digitisation process to Find My Past as a commercial organisation to explore the 1921 census, which is the most extensive British census open to the public, 38 million lives recorded, and these are digitally available, although we'll discuss that they are available at a cost, sadly, at present. We are delivering 2 other webinars, which we can go into a bit later, also with Dr Diana Wilkins on Sussex in 1921 and suffragettes, war widows and sort of trailblazers also. So you can register for those, they're all free. And we're also delivering some drop-in activities in Hastings, and a drop-in day this Saturday at the South Water Centre in St Leonard's if anyone's interested in attending. And we'll also be hosting a disability heritage event, which is part of Disability Pride Month, and that will be next month. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now. A lot of information to take in, and I'm going to ask Diana to take over, and I'm going to pop some links in the chat while we're here, just so you can have a little look at those if you wish to, and let Diana take over. So fire away when you're ready.
Hello everyone. Hopefully you can all see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Great, okay. Well, I'm going to be talking about what the census in 1921 can tell us about Jewish life in Sussex immediately after the First World War. So this makes a nice follow-up to the project that Nicola was mentioning about Shalom Sussex. And I'm going to start with a bit of context about life at the time. Then I'm going to look at some individual case studies showing what was happening to particular people and to particular families and to society. And then after our break, I'll be talking about tips for using the census if you'd like to do that for your own research and how to get the most out of it. So sorry, I'm not able to move the screen up and down. I'm just going to come out and okay.
I found the left and right buttons seem to make it work actually.
Oh dear. Yeah, okay. I'm just going to come out and reopen the reopen the presentation there. Let's see if I can. That is not working for me.
Let me just. Have you tried the right and left buttons, Diana? Because actually, I found that they sort of help.
That's it. Yeah, that's quite good. Sorry about that, everyone. Right, I'll start again. So I'm just going to start with a bit of an overview of where this material comes from. So as Nicola's mentioned, the material from the 1921 census is at the moment only on this family history website called Find My Past. And there's a charge for looking at it, which I'll explain. But there are other types of family history websites, and such as this one called Ancestry UK. There's quite a lot of these. And actually, sometimes it's worth using more than one site to get a good result. And as we go through, I'm going to show you two types of census information. So the first one is this type of summary information that's known as a transcription. And it's obviously a digital product from the original census record. And it's very nice and clear, and it's worth having a look at. But much more useful is the original census record itself, filled in by the person at the time. And this tends to be more accurate, and it may also have a bit more information. So given a choice between the two, I'd always recommend this original record. Now, these family history sites and the online resources available are quite powerful when they're taken together, and they can provide lots of different information. So I've decided to focus down on 3 key questions. So in particular, I'm going to look at what happened to Jewish men who fought in the First World War, what was support for them after the war and for their families, and then more broadly, how did civilian life recover and change? Because at this period, we're less than 3 years after the end of the First World War. And I think we need to think a little bit about the context of this time. It really was a very turbulent period. So the First World War had led to the collapse of 4 empires. So the Russian Empire had come to an end with the Russian Revolution. The Prussian and Austrian-Hungarian empires had ended, and the Ottoman Empire had also collapsed. So this leads to a kind of redrawing of the map of international boundaries in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, and even in parts of the Pacific, and Africa as well. And so people find themselves living in new nations with new borders. And there's a whole series of treaties that run on from the signing of the Peace Treaty of Versailles in 1918 on to 1923. And there's some very major changes at this time that will have consequences for decades to come. For example, 1921 is the year of the Irish War of Independence. The year before, Britain has been assigned the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. And we also had in that year a conference in London which decided the level of reparations that Germany would have to pay for war damages, again affecting the economic survival of that country after the war. And on top of that, there was a global economic depression, particularly in the United States and Europe. And it's into this environment that 3.5 million British servicemen are released from the armed forces into the civilian economy. And as well as the 700,000 men who've been killed during the First World War, there's 1.5 million British personnel who've been injured. There's been 230,000 people have died in the flu epidemic at the end of the war, and there's economic recession and strikes. And we can see this in the actual process of the census itself. So censuses are normally carried out in April, but April that year saw a coal strike, with coal being fundamental to the economy at that time, and a state of emergency was proclaimed, and the census was suspended. The strike didn't go ahead in the end, but the underlying problems in the industry continued and re-emerged in the general strike of 1926. So this census is unusual in that it takes place in June, and then for coastal areas like Sussex, that means that sometimes there's more visitors captured in the census return than there might normally be. Anyway, against this very difficult economic environment, we also see the beginnings of the welfare state. So before the war, old age pensions and national insurance have been introduced. So there's a degree of assistance with healthcare. For soldiers themselves, there's various forms of war pensions and invalidity allowance and workman's compensation. And then where somebody has been killed on active service, widows and orphans are also entitled to a weekly pension. And on top of that, as we go through, we'll see that there's various forms of private and community philanthropic support. So many people are familiar with the British Legion, which was formed in this year to help ex-servicemen. And it's also in this year that a group of Jewish ex-servicemen lay a wreath at the cenotaph in Whitehall, and this begins to form into a League of Old Judeans, and eventually over time forms into the organisation that we know today as the Association of Jewish Ex-Servicemen and Women. So let's have a think about what the Jewish community in Sussex was like at the time. So it had a long established Jewish presence in the county, in coastal towns like Hastings and St Leonard's, Bexhill, Eastbourne, and particularly Brighton, which was home to the largest Jewish community at the time. And the Jewish presence in Brighton had been established from at least the 1760s, and by the 19th and early 20th century, the community was making an impact on civic politics and on the physical fabric of the town. For example, if you were to arrive in Brighton at the station, that was designed by the Jewish architect David Mokata. And if you walk down to the Palace Sphere on the seafront, that was completed by the Jewish entrepreneur Sir John Howard. And it's estimated at the time there were around 400 or 500 members of the Jewish congregation in Brighton. And that number was swelled by summer visitors, because we can see in 1921, Brighton was a very popular seaside destination with hardly a spot to stand on the beach. And this history is reflected in the synagogues that were built along the south coast. So this is the Middle Street Synagogue in Brighton, in the sort of South Lanes area, going towards the beachfront. And that was actually the third synagogue in Brighton, the first one dating from around 1790. Then further along the coast in Eastbourne, the Hebrew congregation had been meeting at this rented building in Susan's Road in Eastbourne since 1918, but in 1921-22 actually purchased the building, which is in operation today. And we also see more people moving to Hove, and that leads to, a bit later in 1929, the establishment of the Hove Hebrew congregation. And we mustn't forget at this time also, in the more rural interior of the county, there were several wealthy Jewish families that had established themselves in country houses with land surrounding them as a form of Jewish gentry. So just outside Worthing, we have the Stern family, descended from German merchant bankers, the Montefiores in near Crawley. This very large building has been demolished, but it's a park, Worth Park at the moment. And then the Messel family, again a German banking family that established itself at Nyman's at Hand Cross outside Horsham. And this is now a National Trust property, but if you go there today, this is not the building that you will see. Later members of the Messel family changed it into a mock Tudor building or Elizabethan building, and unfortunately it was badly damaged by fire in 1947, but it's still a beautiful place and well worth a visit. So I'm going to look now at what happened to Jewish ex-servicemen from the county. And we've actually got a wealth of information about the people who served during the First World War. And one of the core sources of information is this book, British Jury Book of Honour. And this was published in 1922, and it records all the Jewish servicemen in the First World War, their address at the time, and also their regiment. And it also provides a lot of contextual information. So it tells us that around 50,000 Jewish men served in the First World War and with the British forces, and 2,500 of those were killed and 6,500 were injured. And this book is online at a very valuable site called British Jewry, First World War, We Were There Too, and you can browse and search the book. There's also municipal war memorials, like this one in Worthing, which records the names of the war dead. Then there's the archives of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, because some soldiers didn't have a grave and they weren't able to be repatriated to this country, and so the War Graves Commission looks after the graves abroad. And then we have very specific memorials, like this one from the Middle Street Synagogue in Brighton. And this records the names of 125 men associated with the synagogue who enlisted. And it marks 6 of these as having been killed during the conflict. But this is an underestimate, because it records those who are most closely connected with the synagogue, and further research has shown that perhaps 22 men from Sussex were killed during the war. And I'm going to look at some individuals in a little bit more detail. So one of these are the Crook family. So I don't know if you can see, but they're mentioned here at the top of the Middle Street Synagogue. The Crook family were members of the congregation, and one of them would later be its vice president. So the parents of the family, Rebecca and Wolf Crook, came originally from parts of the Russian Empire. Wolf Crook, his name was originally spelt as this, came from Poland, and he came to Britain and took British citizenship in 1905 and established himself as a master tailor in Brighton. When the war came, 3 of his sons, who'd been working with him in the business, joined the Royal Flying Corps, and the RFC was one of, along with the Royal Naval Air Service, was one of 2 existing organisations that were merged towards the end of the war to form the Royal Air Force in 1918. And I'm going to look at the story of Solomon, the elder brother, and he was a rigger in the RFC, and that means someone who's involved in aircraft maintenance. And what's interesting is that we can see that the military records that are available on the family history website, that he lists in the RFC in July 1916. Now, conscription, that is involuntary enlistment for married men, had been brought in May that year, and as Solomon was married with 2 very young children, it's possible that he was required to enlist rather than a volunteer. He belongs to the RFC and then transferred to the Royal Air Force when that's formed. He's discharged from the Air Force in February 1919, so 4 months after the end of the war, and then he's associated with the RAF Reserves until April 1920. I thought that might happen. So we can see that there's quite a long tail to people's military service, and by the time that the 1921 census is conducted, he's only really recently left the armed forces. So I thought it'd be interesting to see what happens to him after the war and whether he's able to resume his previous business. And we can see that this is the census return for Solomon in 1921. And I've written the names here on the left as well to make them nice and clear. So Solomon is here as the head of the family, and his employment is he's a gents tailor. So he's essentially carried on the business that he learned with his father, but he's an employer. He's actually got his own business. And the census tells us that while he's living in Market Street in Hove, his place of employment where he's running his business from is in Bedford Square. And the census data also tells us something interesting about standards of living at the time. So this little box at the bottom tells us how many rooms the house had. So it says that in total there were 2 males, 3 females, so that's a total of 5 people, and then there were 5 rooms, excluding the kitchen. So relatively tight living conditions. So on the list of residents, we have Solomon, his wife Jenny, also known as Jane, their 2 children, Harry and Josephine, and then we have a servant, a general domestic servant called Polly Simmons. And I think this is an interesting point of social history here, because she's only 14, and this isn't a picture of her, it's a stock photo, but it just stands in for those girls who were working by this age. So 1918 had seen the school leaving age raised to 14. Previously it had been 12, and many girls had left school and gone straight into service. After the end of the First World War, domestic service, which had been a huge employment of women and girls, is less popular. It's not seen as well paid compared to working in shops and businesses, and it's less popular to live in the house with your employer. And so people tend to not have as many servants, and they tend to have one servant that does everything. And so this might be Polly Simmons' role, and girls of her age at this time might be paid as little as £8 a year, whereas an adult woman, a domestic servant, might earn between 28 and £40 a year. And I thought, because there's a charge for getting the census data, it's £3.50 to look at this form, I thought it's worth mentioning that there are other ways of getting the same information that are free, and that can also act as a cross-check on the census information and tell you which record you want to look at. And that's the Electoral Register, which records who can vote in parliamentary and local elections. And if we look here in 1921, we can see that Jenny and Solomon Crook are registered at 45 Lower Market Street. And the 1923 register also gives us the additional information that while Solomon is living in Market Street, his place of employment is Bedford Square. And before we move on, I think it's just worth noting the 1918 Electoral Register. So 1918 was also the year of the Representation of the People Act, which had trebled the number of people who could vote. And it included women for the first time, some women over 30, and many more working class men. And so Jenny, who's just in her early 30s, appears in the register as a parliamentary voter for the first time, and Solomon is recorded as a naval and military voter, which means that his vote will be sent to him wherever he's stationed. Now, as far as we know, the Crook brothers survived the war physically uninjured, but that was clearly not the case for many. And I'm going to look at the story of one person who was quite badly injured in the First World War. And this is Gershon Shevitsky. He's this person here at the front, and he's with members of something called the Zion Mule Corps. And this was a transport corps that was actually formed in the Middle East, and it did its recruiting mainly in Egypt, and that's where Gershon Shevitsky joined up. So his family were originally from Russia, that's where he was born, and they moved to Palestine around 1902, and he has volunteered to join this corps which helped the British Army. And it draws attention to the fact that the British services were made up of people in established regiments based in this country. Many of the people that we studied in the Shalom Sussex project were part of the Royal Sussex Regiment. But for those who didn't have British citizenship, particularly people who'd emigrated from the Russian Empire, who'd fled persecution there and come to Britain's big cities, there was another option, which was the Royal Fusiliers, the 38th to 40th Battalions, and this is its cap badge. And so Gershon Shavitsky, at this time, someone who's not British citizenship, but is fighting as part of the British Armed Services. And later in 1916, he does volunteer to join the West Sussex Regiment. He fights in the Dardanelles in Turkey, and then later in France, and that's where he's wounded. So he's wounded in Ypres in November 1917. So he must have been quite badly wounded, because he's repatriated to Brighton for treatment in the York Place Hospital. And this is a photo of him here from his time in hospital. And we can see that he's not wearing a military uniform. He's wearing a soft pale blue uniform, which showed that someone was an injured ex-serviceman receiving treatment, not someone trying to avoid signing up for the armed forces. Now, he'd been shot in the left shoulder, and he's discharged from the army as medically unfit in 1918. And his military records suggest that this is a permanent disability with a 40% degree of injury. Now, his occupation before the war had been as a carpenter or joiner. So as raises a real question of whether that's something that he'll actually be able to carry on. And when he's discharged, his records also ask, what does he think he's going to do and where does he think he's going to live? And he says he's not sure about his occupation at that point. And he also indicates that he might get back to Alexandria in Egypt. So I've used the census to see if this is actually the case. And so, in fact, he doesn't return to the Middle East. He stays in Britain and moves to London. And here he is, Gershon Shavitsky. He's the head of the household, and he's recorded his birthplace as Russian. He's married. He married in 1918, just shortly after he was discharged from the forces. This is his wife, Edith, née Cams, and their two sons, Cyril and Martin. And the census shows that Gershon Shavitsky is a shop fitter on his own account, so he's running his own business, and he is, despite his injury, still working in sort of carpentry and joinery. And this is confirmed a bit later by a record from the London Gazette, and that's again freely available online, and that's a kind of a newspaper of official record. So it records things like name changes, if people get military honours or civil honours, or if there's legal disputes. So it is quite a useful source of information. And we can see here that Gershon Shavitsky, his name spelled slightly differently, has now changed his name to George Savitt, so it's become more anglicised, and that he's a carpenter and joiner operating from Old Compton Street. And if we look a little later in the Gazette, we see actually that George's business has gone bankrupt in the early 30s. So this is around the time of the Great Depression, a very difficult time for businesses generally. And but it does tell us that as well as living in Old Compton Street, he has a separate business premises in Wardour Mews. And later records from the 40s shows that he's back in business. He's recovered from the challenging period of the Depression. So just to reflect on the research process here, there are a number of challenges. So on the very positive side, Gershon-Chavitsky is well documented. His military records are accessible. And then his son, Martin Savitt, very generously donated materials to the Jewish Museum in London, and they're online. And they're also available via the site. We were there too. On the other hand, as you probably noticed, there's some uncertainties in details about his location and where he was born. So Gershon himself, when he's asked on the census, clearly states that he was born originally as Russian, but in other records, including the military records and in the Gazette, it's suggested that his roots are in the old Ottoman Empire, and I think this is due to the fact that he signed up for the armed forces in Palestine. And then again, you can see all sorts of different spellings here. So there's the name change to Savitt, but there's a number of different spellings of the first name, either with an I or an E. And in this case, where Gershon has written his name himself, it appears that he's written it with an O and an S, but in the online transcription, this has turned out as an A. So again, it's initially quite difficult to find him. And if you counter this, the way around it is to use these wild cards, these stars, to pick up people with a similar name. Just base it on the part of the name that you think you are certain about or hasn't changed, and then the star will allow you to pick up Gershons and Georges and all sorts of different names. So the system is quite sophisticated, and then combined with other knowledge about the person, you can pick out the right person. So Gershon-Chavitsky was able to continue despite his injury, whereas for other people, they may have lost an arm or a leg, and their future did look more difficult. However, there were considerable efforts made to help them, including in Brighton, and that's what I'm going to turn to now. So the first person I'm going to talk about is Sir Bernard Oppenheimer. He was originally from Germany, but he and his family went back and forth to South Africa because he was involved in the diamond mining industry and in diamond trading. We can't find his record in the 1921 census because he died 6 days before it was taken, and it doesn't look like his, perhaps understandably, that his family filled out the return at all. But this is where the Electoral Register comes in useful. It was taken earlier in the year, and we can see Bernard Oppenheimer and his wife Lena, and then their 2 children, Beatrice and Otto, and then the Polacks, and Justin Polak was a patent agent and maybe either a relative or business partner of Sir Bernard. And the fact that Sir Bernard is recorded here with his title reflects the fact that this year, in 1921, he'd been knighted for his philanthropic activities for ex-servicemen. And his engagement with the war effort can be seen from his volunteer records as well. So during the war, he was a volunteer driver in London with the British Red Cross, so perhaps ferrying patients around to hospitals, helping out with administrative tasks. And this is a really good place to look for people like volunteers and nurses. But his efforts weren't restricted just to that. So he was involved in the diamond business, as I've said, and so he came up with the idea to open a factory for cutting and polishing diamonds in Brighton, and it was at the corner, well, the building still stands, it was at the corner of Lewis Road and Coombe Road. Here it is today, and it opened in 1918, And he started by employing wounded ex-soldiers in the business, initially 300 people, and later up to 2,000 people who were paid an allowance by the Ministry of Works. And then to accommodate these extra people, the extension was built on the south side of the Combe Road and opened in 1921. And in fact, that was received a royal visit that year. So in February 1921, the Prince of Wales, who would later become Edward VIII, visited Brighton. And the main part of his visit was to unveil the Chatri War Memorial north of Brighton on the Downs. And some of you may have visited this. It's publicly accessible. And the Chatri marks the spot where a number of Indian soldiers who had died in Brighton hospitals, were cremated. And we could see there a very large official delegation to unveil the Chatri. It fell into disrepair at the period after the war, but has now been restored to its former prominence. But while the Prince of Wales was in the area, he also visited a number of the workshops that had been set up to help badly injured people. For example, we can see this was Queen Mary's workshop for amputees, and this was set up right in the grounds of the Royal Pavilion itself, and it's where it trained men with new occupations such as cobblers, electrical engineering, motor mechanics, with the hope of giving them some future employment. And the same afternoon that the Prince of Wales visited the diamond factory, he also visited this toy factory where ex-servicemen were making board games and toys for sale. And this was the hope that this would provide some income for them in the future. How, of course, we are entering a very difficult economic period, and the Oppenheimer factory actually goes into liquidation in 1924, and those people have to find a different way of making a living. And of course, the 700,000 men had been killed in the British services, and they'd left behind an estimated 500,000 widows and 750,000 children. So there's a huge burden of loss, both emotional and economic, at the time when men were generally the main breadwinner. And I'm going to look at one particular case, and that is of the Cancino family. On the left here we have Joshua Cancino. He was born in Morocco, but a British subject. He was part of a family, a trading family with strong ties to Manchester, and he eventually moves to Manchester and goes to Manchester University, where he trains as a scientist. He also trains in Europe, and in 1916 he marries his wife Beryl Johnston in Paris, and they have a child. Sadly, he is killed very shortly afterwards, before his daughter is born. He's killed in France, trying to save another serviceman, in a very brave action. And he's one of the people who has no known grave, but is instead commemorated on a communal memorial, and also on the Worthing Memorial at the request of his wife, because she lived in the town. So when I came to look at what had happened to Beryl and her daughter Jocelyn after the First World War, my initial thought that they would be living in Worthing. This had been her address before the war. It's where her parents lived, but that wasn't actually the case. She was in Salford and Manchester with her in-laws. And here we have their 1921 census return. So we see that the head of the household is Minnie Cancino, and she's a widow. And we can see that this column in the census particularly asks people over 15 whether they're single, married, or widowed, and then for children under 15 to say whether their parents are both alive or if one or other of them is dead. And of course, this is one of the ways of capturing the impact of the First World War. So along with Minnie, there are her three sons, Isaac, Abraham, and Moses. They are all merchants. Two of them are living at home and one is a visitor. Then there's the daughter Bettina and a grandson, Manuel. And we can see, I can read it for you, that it says that his father is, I think it says his father is alive, but his mother is dead. Then there's Beryl Cancino, a widow, and her daughter Jocelyn, so Joshua's daughter, and it records that her father is dead. And then there's a servant as well. So a large family living in Salford, in the Brighton area, in a house with 9 rooms. And if we look at some additional information that we get with the census, we get the registration district, and that shows us this part of Manchester, and this is the Broughton registration district. This is where their street would have been. And using their address, we can use things like Google Earth and Google Street View to look at what the general area is like. I would say I would tend to use this with caution because obviously over 100 years, houses get knocked down, they get divided, they get renumbered, whole streets can be removed, but it is worth looking in case it looks like the house is unchanged from that time. So if we look at Beryl's overall journey, we can see that she was the 1891 census records her that she was born in Horsham. Before the war, she's moved to Worthing with her parents. She married Joshua Cancino in 1914, and their address is this house in Worthing during the war. In 1916, she gives birth to her daughter, interestingly in Manchester, so again near her in-laws. And you can see that Bettina is Jocelyn's middle name, and that's her aunt's name. In 1921, she's in Salford, as we've discussed, but then 1922, she's back in Worthing again, and we can tell that from military records where she writes to the Ministry of Defence asking for her husband's campaign medals, and that she spends the rest of her life in Worthing, and she's on home duties, which means that she's subsisting on the widow's pension, although by 1939 her daughter is in the workforce as a shorthand typist. So moving on to religious life, I'm going to talk about Reverend Lieberman, who was the rabbi for the Brighton synagogue. At the time, rabbis were known by the title Reverend. And as you can see from this photo of him, the Reverend Lieberman was quite a young man. He was in his in his late 20s. He just married and just took over this role in 1915 when he was requested to go and serve in France as a chaplain to the Jewish forces. And around 20 rabbis did do this. It went out to the front to supervise religious services and pastoral care and burials. Reverend Lieberman survived the war and returned to Brighton to continue as a rabbi. and this is recorded in the 1921 census. Here we have him, and we can see that he's put his occupation as Minister of Religion. And that's interesting because sometimes rabbis describe themselves as ministers of Jewish religion, sometimes simply as ministers of religion. And what that means is that a very broad search with a term like just using the term Jewish may or may not pick up people, because at this time the census didn't ask you about your religious beliefs. It would only appear in the census if you added that information yourself, or if someone added it on your behalf, as we'll see. And he's given his place of work as the Middle Street Synagogue, and he's there with his wife Irene and son George, and also his brother Reuben, an ex-serviceman who's now beginning to establish himself as a solicitor in London. And they're living in Granville Road in Hove, and that's what the street looks like today. Also associated with the Middle Street Synagogue, oh, I'm sorry, I just mentioned this. So if you are looking into your own family, it's really useful to just look at this document that comes with the census record about the registration district. And that's because that's what will appear as where your ancestor is living in the summary information. And Brighton has its own registration district, whereas Hove, Preston and Shoreham are all part of this Stenning district. So when one looks sometimes at records such as that's Reverend Lieberman, in the summary information, it appears that he's living in Stenning. It doesn't mean he's living in a small rural village. It means he's in the Hove area. And you can find that out by looking in more detail at the address. It's just something to be aware of. And so returning to people associated with the Middle Street Synagogue, we have here the Lubetsky family, Lazarus and Rebecca and their children. Lazarus and his wife are from Russia, and his employment is as supervisor of kosher, and he's put in brackets, Jewish meat for the Brighton and Brighton Hebrew congregation. And his place of work is 20 Bond Street, which is where the butchers which provided the kosher meat for the congregation. And we can see that the son Jonathan is now an estate agent's clerk in London, but he had served in the Labour Corps during the war, and his name is on the Middle Street Memorial. And this is a shot of the Bedford Place where they were living, with 11 rooms, so fairly comfortable conditions. And then I also mentioned that the Eastbourne synagogue had purchased its premises and appointed a new minister, and that was Wolf Jacobs, originally from Poland, like his wife Jane, and he's described himself as Minister of Jewish Religion. But he also has, president of the congregation, but he also has a job working for George Marks, a jeweller in Seaside in Eastbourne. And as well as Wolf and his wife, we can see that they have 3 lodgers. And if we look at this last person, Gertrude Galloway, she's married, but she's described herself as here not occupied, but having a disablement, independent but not invalided, do nothing but go out. And that's why these census records are particularly interesting, because they allow people to express what's happening in their life and to identify themselves as they wish to be identified. And it's also interesting because the 1921 census, unlike the 1911 census, doesn't ask a question about health. So it's up to people themselves if they want to record that. And we can see also this person is reflected that they're an old age pensioner, so they're receiving the new pension that has been more recently brought in. And if we look, we use this data to look at where the family were living. This is Willowfield Road. This is what it looks like now. And this area here is Susan's Road, where the synagogue is. So it's just a short walk away from where Wolfe Jacobs was living. And then this is Seaside Road, where he was working. So all in a very compact area. I'm going to quickly move on to business life and the Dudkin family. So Abraham was born in Russia, in Novgorod, in the fur capital of that country, and he came to Britain as a furrier and became a British citizen during the First World War. But he's not only a furrier, he branches out and buys a chain of photographic studios in Brighton and as far as Portsmouth. And for that reason, a lot is known about this family on the site Photo History Sussex, because some of the information about their own amateur films and photography businesses has been made available. So that's really worth a look at if you've got some extra time. So here the Dudkin family are in the 1911 census. We can see Alfred as head of the family. He's described himself as a furrier, even though he will move into the photography business as well. His wife known as Ray, a son Lewis, his sister who's a visitor, and a servant. And they're living in Bedford Place, so they're just two doors down from the Lubitsky family. But because they're well researched, I also know more about them. So I know that Alfred's original name was Abraham, that Ray had also been known as Rachel, and that Blanche was known as Bloomer, and also that she emigrates to the United States in 1918. So taking all this into account, when it comes to looking for them in the 1921 census, I decided to look for someone who I thought their name wouldn't change, or there'd be less uncertainty. So I picked the one-year-old son, Lewis, on that basis. And how wrong I was, because here's the 1921 census, and none of the names other than Alfred's appear in this summary list. And the reason for that will become clear when we look at the actual record itself. So here's Alfred Dudkin. Here's his wife Ray, but if we look back at the transcription, we can see that's been rendered as Roy. We go back, here's the son Stanley, and here he is, and this is actually Lewis Stanley, and he uses Lewis and Stanley at different points in his life and goes back to Lewis later. And then there's a daughter, Rosie, who's been born since the 1911 census. So it is possible to find people, but you have to take a bit of care in selecting the right record. Fortunately, Dudkin is quite an unusual name, and there are only two families with that surname in Sussex at the time. This other person is Mordecai, who is Alfred's brother, and his family. And at this time, again, he's described himself as a furrier and an employer, and they are living in Dyke Road, which you might know is a pleasant area, and they have 15 rooms. And one thing that's quite marked about the Dudkin family history is how much they travelled. And it's well worth bearing in mind at this time that people are emigrating to this country, from this country. They're going abroad for work, and like the Oppenheimer family, and they're going abroad to visit family and for holidays. And that's particularly true of the Dudkins. They travel on foreign holidays before the war, and before the First World War and before the Second World War. And that's useful because it means that shipping records will pick them up for us. Here we have Minnie, Lewis and Abraham, and they're traveling on the Queen Mary, which had recently been launched as a luxury liner, and they're going to New York. And at this time, there were 2 services a week from Southampton to New York. So some sections of the population are very mobile. So it may mean that they are not necessarily in the place that you're expecting when you look for them in the records. And then another aspect of modern life I just wanted to touch on is, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a huge increase in people's ability to vote. The electorate was much larger, and 2 of the people that had fought for this were Edith and Israel Zangwill, here in the centre, and they were particularly associated with the campaign for women's right to vote. They lived in East Preston in West Sussex, and this commemorates their time there. Israel Zangwill was also a playwright and writer and a campaigner for a Jewish homeland. And their political activities are actually captured in the census returns. So in the 1911 census, there was an actual boycott of the census by more active suffrage campaigners, because they believed that if women weren't able to vote, they shouldn't have to pay taxes or carry out citizens' duties like the filling in the census. And we've got evidence of it here from the Zangwill's 1911 census return. Very unusually, it starts by listing 2 servants, Lillian Hockery and Sarah Grindrod, and then a different hand, possibly that of the census official, has added Edith Zangwill and her daughter Margaret. And then Edith herself has written, the rest of the household is not entered, as we feel that until women have the political rights of citizens, they should not perform the duties of citizens. Mr. Zangwill is not at home. Signed, Mrs. Edith Zangwill. And that reflects the policy of their more radical Women's Social Political Union, commonly known as the Suffragettes. And the couple would also go on to support the Jewish League for Women's Suffrage, which was formed in 1912. By the time of the 1921 census, things have changed quite a lot. Women over 30 have the vote. There's continued parliamentary efforts to try and get the vote for the rest of women, which doesn't actually succeed until 1928, but there's no census boycott at this period. So we can see that in the 21 census, the hierarchy has re-established itself. Israel Zangwill is at the top of the census. He's an author working at home. Edith Zangwill has also noted a profession. She's a published author, as well as a housewife. There are 2 children, a governess, and a servant and a visitor. And they're living in a reasonably large house in East Preston. So my final thing I wanted to mention was that there was a good deal of private and institutional help for people. We've already heard about the diamond polishing factory, but there were other forms of support. So one of these was provided by the Stern family of merchant bankers. Unfortunately, the best photo that we had of them is from the 1950s. So this is Sybil and Fredrick Stern. Fredrick Stern was a multimillionaire and a racehorse owner in his youth, but he also felt his philanthropic responsibilities, and he invited this youth club from London's East End to bring young people to holiday on the hills above his house each year from the 1920s onwards. But we can see he was really well off. This is his home with 24 rooms. Fredrick and Sybil at the top, he's described as a merchant banker. And then there's 7 servants on the list, and then there were a further 3 living off-site. And really, it's only the very well off that by this time that would still have this quite hierarchical system of footmen and hall boys, because people were just moving into other occupations at the time. And then apart from private philanthropy, there were institutions that help people who are, in particular people who were unwell, because for years people have been coming to Brighton for fresh air and the seaside. And there was a Jewish convalescent home in Hove, and we can see this drawing is the signature on it is by T.J. Laneson. He was also the architect of the Middle Street synagogue. And the census return shows us there were around 30 Jewish children staying there, recuperating. They're all patients. And this form is filled in by Ellen North, the matron. And if we just look at one of the patients here, Cecilia Dockerell, we can see that she's born in London, and then the matron has described her as, like the other children, as Jewish, British born. And then although she's a patient and only 14, it says that she's left school and no present employment. So again, that does tell us something about the expectations for young people at the time, that they should be entering employment. And it's not just Jewish convalescent homes. If we look at this, the Metropolitan Convalescent Home for men in Bexhill, this records David Tempelhoff, who is a Polish Jewish sailor who's out of work and originally from Stepney, and Samson Ayres, a Jewish watchmaker who's retired and has had a business in Ireland. And this form is all filled out by the splendidly named Maud Crump, who's the lady superintendent of the Metropolitan Convalescent Home. So I hope this shows that it is possible to use the census to identify individuals, families, and to search for institutions to find what's happened to people in the aftermath of the war. And although these are individual stories, I think we do see evidence that families are providing support for people affected by the war. For example, Beryl Consino is with her in-laws for the birth of her child and in the early 20s. Reuben Lieberman is living with his brother while he establishes himself as a solicitor. There's new forms of state support, such as the old age pension and widow's pension, but there's private help as well in terms of trying to find new forms of employment for those who are injured, such as the diamond polishing factory and the convalescent home. We see servicemen like Solomon Crook and Gershon Shavitsky resuming their pre-war careers, getting married and starting families. And although some businesses fail in the difficult conditions of the 20s and 30s, others, like the Dudkins, prosper. And importantly, people are mobile and moving around. This is a time of high outward emigration from Britain, as well as people who've moved from this country from the Russian Empire and elsewhere. And people are moving around within the country. So it's good to be open in terms of where we look for people's records. And then finally, we can see the Jewish community in Sussex consolidating, buying premises for the synagogues in Eastbourne and expanding westward into Hove. So I hope that's been interesting for you. We're going to take a short break now for about 10 minutes. So Nicola, if you can let us know when you'd like us to come back, and then we'll come back to some tips on using the census and for people's questions.
So everyone, thank you so much for that, Diana. That was fascinating and, you know, just really interesting to find some new ways around having to pay for Find My Past 1921 census, you know, some of these really useful tips like the Electoral Register. So we've run over by only a couple of minutes. So why don't we come back? We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 11:25 and then Diana will talk a bit more about some of the research and some of the findings, and then we're going to take some questions and answers. So if you wanted to post in the chat, I can collate some of those if you've got questions, and we really look forward to that. And then afterwards, later this month, we'll post this onto YouTube, and we will share the links as well with you, so we'll be able to do that. So if we stop now for 10 minutes, we'll come back pronto at 11:25, and we'll see you all then. Okay. What I'll do actually is I will turn everyone's sound. If I ask you to mute, if everyone can just sort of mute themselves, that's probably the way forward, so we can have a comfort break in peace. Hello, everyone. So we're just getting ready to come back to start again for some more information. We've had our archivist from West Sussex Records Office has had to go off to a meeting, Diana. So we're one down, but she's going to catch up with the second half on our YouTube channel when we put that up, and she's found it very useful. Yes, if everyone's got something to drink and is ready to start, we could probably crack on.
Great, thank you. So the next section is really, let's hope, sorry, look at that. I might just have to reshare again, get it going again. Oh, sorry. Right, yeah, here we go. I'm just going to talk about how we can get the most out of the census and use it for your own research. And it can be about family research, or it can be on a particular topic, like migration or disability or women's history. It's all sorts of, or history of your town or your street. It's all sorts of things that you can use it for. And one way to do that is online. If you have a family history account, you can put together a family tree like this one that I've done for the Zangwill family. And what's really handy about that is it allows you to see how people are connected. It allows you to store all the records that you find and associate them with an individual that you're researching, so you can always go back and check them later. And the system itself will also provide hints. So these little orange circles here are things that the system has found that things might be related to the person you're interested in. Again, I would treat these with caution. Sometimes they're really useful. Sometimes they're not the right person. So you can review them before you accept them. And also you can link them with other people who may be researching the same family or a connected family. And that way you get more information to bring together. However, again, and I've had personal experience of this, sometimes when you look at somebody's family tree, you go, that's not the right person. So you do need to treat some of this information a bit carefully. So how would you get to the situation where you've ended up with a detailed family tree like this? Well, the best analogy I can think of is really as a jigsaw puzzle where you bring together bits of information from different places, because each type of information will tell you a different thing. And the more that you can bring together, the more chance they have of being right, but also the fuller picture that they can help you build up, and also suggest more avenues for you to research. So before I start a piece of research, I like to try and think about the context of the time. Why might people be moving around the country? Would they have had war service, or would they have volunteered as a nurse? Would that direct me to certain records that I could look at? And also, it helps me understand what I'm seeing. So we can see, for example, in the things that I've shown you, the way that people describe themselves varies quite a bit. Jobs that people had in the past don't exist nowadays. So it's just sort of getting into the sense of how language was used at the time. I also start quite wide and then narrow down my search. So again, as we've seen, the spelling of people's names, their birth dates, their countries of origins can vary. So when you search online, it's worth having those parameters set quite wide and then narrowing them down as you get more certain that you're looking at the right person. And then I think it's possible to build up a picture using free resources, so that when you come to select the census record that you need to pay for, you know that you're picking the right person. And I'll explain how to do that. And then I think it's good to use multiple sources because they can tell you different things. And then also to try and look for original sources. Quite often when we see things written online, facts have kind of drifted over time. So I think it's really good to try and get the original census record or the original newspaper report, so you can understand for yourself the exact facts. And then it's really important to check everything and save everything, either in a family tree or on your own computer. So I'm going to give a quick example of how to find someone in the 1921 census. And I'm going to look at the family of Captain Jacob de Meza. His family lived in Brighton, although he was originally from London. He served in the First World War and was awarded a military cross, but was killed in action. And I'm going to be looking for his wife, Adelaide, more often known as Daisy de Meza, and her maiden name was Heilbrunn. And Jacob de Meza is memorialized on the Middle Street tablets. And I'm only going to use a few pieces of information to find Adelaide's record. So I'm going to use her full name. I'm also lucky in this case because I know her maiden name, and if you do know that, that's very helpful. And I know her date of birth. Now I know it exactly, but I'm going to allow the system to use a range of birth dates because that is something that does tend to vary on records. I also know where she's born, but I'm not going to put that in as a filter to begin with because again, that can be a bit misleading, as we've seen, and also in the way that places are described. So London is a classic in that places we now think of as being in London are often described as being in Middlesex, which was the case at the time. And so here is her 1921. Sorry, I'm going to start by looking back at her family before she was married, so under her maiden name. And here she is in 1911, and she's living in London, Middlesex. And we can see she's with her father and mother and two siblings. We can see there's a transcription error in the name of her father. When you look at the original record, it's quite understandable. It could be a U, but you can see that that would make him difficult to find if you were searching on his surname. And in other records related to this family, I've seen that as a W. So we can see that does occur quite often. However, it hasn't affected her record. And so we know who the other members of her household are, and I'll show you why that's going to be useful. So 1921, she's a widow, and we know that she's had a child, but clearly we don't know who else she might be living with. And if we look at the 21 census, she does appear in it. Again, her name has been slightly mistranscribed, and it's as de Meza, all one word, but we can be sure it's her because the birth year is more or less all right. And also, before you buy, you're able to hover over it and you can see who else is living in the same address. And you can see that the names are Felix and Priscilla, her parents. So that makes it really quite likely that this is Adelaide, who's gone back to her parents after the death of her husband. And it's also brought up a record from 1923, which actually shows that Adelaide remarried at that point. And here's the full census. So Felix and Priscilla, the two siblings, their son, there's Adelaide, and then there's her daughter, Doreen. And again, we can see that the census has recorded that her father has died. And then we can see where they're living in Hove. So with only a small bit of information, we've been able to identify them. Now I'm going to say a little bit about free resources. So the family history websites that I have mentioned, if you have your own subscription, that tends to vary between about £10 and £13 a month, depending on the level of subscription you have. However, there are ways to access this information for free. And in particular, if you go into your local library, you can use a family history website for free. The census records for 1921 still cost money, but all the other material is free. And even if you are at home, you can log into the library website with your library card and look at online reference materials like the Times newspaper or the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Another good place to look for helpful information is the National Archives, the source of all of this information, and they produce some really interesting and useful research guides which describe what sort of records might be available and where they're held. And so that really alerts you to things you might not have known existed, but also means you don't need to waste your time. If something hasn't been digitized, you know that you have to go either to the archives or the record office to find that. And in particular, one thing that is useful to visit the National Archives for is the Naturalization Certificates, where people become British citizens. They've generally not been digitized, but you can see the originals, and that tends to give much more detail about the exact place that somebody's come from in another country, and their names and their family names when they arrived here. And so that can be very useful if you want to trace your family further back into a different country. There's all sorts of materials about divorce, crime, registers. Where they're not been digitized, you can actually see them for real in record offices like the Keep at Falmer or the West Sussex County Office in Chichester. So I've mentioned how you can access the history websites for free, and I should just say all the material for the previous census is free to look at, and the London Gazette. Sometimes special collections of military records may cost extra, and so when you choose your type of subscription, if that's what you want to do, be careful that you get the one that picks up the right sort of information that you're going to be interested in. And there are other sites which I've listed here. Sometimes you can just search them for free or have a trial, and that might pick up some useful information for you. And as I said earlier, I would always choose the original census record over the transcription. If nothing else, it's in your ancestors' own handwriting and provides their own signature, which is really interesting to see. And just to be aware that if you follow the hints in the family tree, they tend to direct you to the transcript, and you might accidentally end up buying that, and it's better to do it via a search in the census. And then you can combine all these sources and check them against one another, save them in the family tree, or download them to your computer, or just do Control Print Screen and then capture your screen and save it in a Word document so you can refer back to it. And then it's really accessible for you. And I'm just going to pick up some specialist resources. So this is Fold 3, connected to Ancestry, and that has all the military records. Again, you do have to pay for that one after the trial period. Something that is free is the We Were There Too site, which has lots of information about individual servicemen, but also nurses, and some very helpful overview essays and access to the Book of Honour. And then the Red Cross makes freely available records of volunteer nurses and drivers during the First World War. And then there's a long list of specialist resources that are particularly relevant to the Jewish community. So there's the newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, and you can quickly search their archive with keywords and get a sort of snippet, which will tell you whether it's worth them paying to see the original article, which I think is about £2.50 a go. Then there's a lot of free material here, including the Jewish genealogy website, which is particularly useful for looking at records in other countries. And then there's a lot of contextual information available from the Jewish Historical Society, the Jewish Museum, and the Jewish Small Communities Network, and J Trails, which talks about Jewish local history. And finally, there's the Shalom Sussex project, which contains more on the lives of some of the people I've talked about today, and the Jewish Country Houses Research Project, which looks at this sort of Jewish landowning aristocracy in the interwar period. So I hope that's been useful. I'm just going to mention again that we've got 2 upcoming seminars and these drop-in days where there's a chance to explore the census for yourself. But I'd be very happy to take any questions or observations. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was fascinating, and I'm sure everyone else has found it really useful to look at all of this information from very different angles, some practical and some from a sort of historical background. And Alice is saying, "Thanks, Diana, brilliant and informative." That's great. So we've got 20 minutes or just under 20 minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to let me know, we haven't had any questions yet, but we're really happy to host some in the next sort of 20, just under 20 minutes. So do type or say if you wanted to do that. I think that would be really useful. I've just posted a link to the Find My Path, which is where you can record an error on their transcription. There's a sort of ongoing Twitter thread about this, sort of people posting about errors related to their family history. So you can do that in the cases of things like, sort of Roy instead of Ray, and the Demazes being written as one word rather than two for their surname, for example. So if you see a family sort of transcription error, then you can kind of contact them to do that, and they're pretty prompt at sorting that out, I think.
Yes, that's very helpful if you can do that. And I've been a transcriber on another research project, and I know it's very understandable. I know they have received some criticism for this, but actually sometimes with handwriting it's almost impossible to tell, and that's often why I look at the transcription and then compare it with the original and try and come as a sort of best guess. I think the other thing as a family member or as a researcher, you'll know much more about the person, so you'll know that their name is Demeza. You'll know that, and so it's very easy for you to spot. You'll know who else is in your family, and sometimes even if you don't think you know it, it will come to you. So I thought I didn't know my paternal grandmother's maiden name, but when I saw it come up in the census, I recognized it immediately, because it's sort of passive knowledge that we do have. So whatever you can gather from what people have told you over the past, what families say about family history, all of that material is really useful in building up a picture of your family. Some of it might not be quite right, but often it will give you pointers to look in the right direction. And it's also quite thrilling when you see those family stories actually confirmed by what you can see in the census data. For example, recently I found a record of when my mother was evacuated to Cornwall during the Second World War, and I could see her there with her sister and cousin living in a tiny farmhouse in Cornwall. So those moments are really worth it.
Thank you, Diana. So we've had a request to go back to the page with the links on for the Jewish research.
Yes, yeah.
section. If you could go back one.
Yeah, let's see if it's willing.
Just to say as well, so we're working with a master's student at the University of Brighton. As I mentioned, this is a partnership project with the University of Brighton, and one of the master's students there has been working on digitising the 1921 census for Find My Path, Lucy Daish, and she's been a great resource for us in terms of sort of finding little gems. And one of the things she's mentioned is if you've got Jewish family history, the language section on the 1921 census for non-speaking English households had people marking that they spoke Yiddish, sort of as well as or instead of English or other languages. So that might be a good way to sort of mark out someone's sort of, religious kind of heritage. And she's also mentioned that the Russian Revolution meant that there were many refugees listed. So that could be something of note. That was obviously in 1917, as that could have meant many Jewish families came to Britain around that time. So maybe didn't show up in the 1911 census, but did in the 1921 census, for example.
Yes, and you can just use a keyword search. So you can, and I have done some of this. So you just put in the word Jewish, and that will pick that out if people have added that information, or if that's in the title of an institution. But you could pick it. I've also looked at strike because we also had a strike around that time. So that's something you can try, and you can also, I think you can try and, sorry, I'm just lost my train of thought there for a moment. But there are, you can also, on the National Archives website, there's a way, there's a research guide about looking for institutions, so schools, hospitals, convalescent homes, and that might be sometimes when you're looking for someone and you don't actually see them in the in the in the census, it's because they're away from home. It could also be that they're in hotels. So I wanted to see once whether somebody had taken part in the 1911 census census evasion, and they weren't at home. I thought, oh, this could be interesting, but it turned out they were in a hotel. So and they'd been put down by the hotel staff. So looking for institutions is quite helpful, and you can do that by just looking for the address as well. You can search for the address if you've got an idea of where someone might be.
That's fantastic. I'm just wondering also, one of the things that we'll do once we've put the video onto our YouTube channel, the Strike Alike YouTube channel, is we will send out a list, or it may come from our administrator, a list of the links that we've looked at today and the useful ones that Diana's been sharing. And sort of related information. I'm just wondering, Diana, whether you'd be happy for us to share a PDF of this talk. I know not always that's not always sort of convenient, but if that's something you're happy to do, that's a nice thing to do too.
Yes, that's happy. We just have to check with the copyright around the census records, but I'm certainly happy with that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions, anyone? We're really happy to field any more. Has anyone got any sort of, has anyone else been doing some research into sort of family history during the 1921 census? No one there? And also, I don't know whether any of you are sort of Hastings and St Leonard's based, but we're working with the master's student I mentioned earlier, Lucy Daish, to deliver sort of six weeks of sessions in two venues in Hastings and St Leonard's, and that will be kind of very hands-on with her going through some of these little gems. But we also have, if you're free, this Saturday morning at I think it's 11 o'clock, I should know, 11 till 1 at the South Water Centre in St Leonard's. We have a sort of open morning, which is looking specifically at the 1921 census. And we'll have some laptops and tea and biscuits there. So if you're free and you wanted to go, you're very welcome to just turn up. We'd be very happy to have you.
thing I might just mention is something that Lucy picked up that I didn't have time to include today. So we can see the beginnings of the welfare state at this time, but the previous system, the poor law system, is still in effect, and there's still poor law institutions. So these are what in the past would be called workhouses, but are places that are providing some degree of support for the poorest in society. And there was a poor law institution in Elm Grove, and that had a Jewish resident as well. And this is the sort of the last gasp of that system, which is finally done away with in 1928. And we see a much more kind of state benefits coming through. I think it's also interesting to think about the levels of pensions. So people like Beryl Cancino would have been in 1919, that was around, you'd be paid around 19 shillings a week to live on, and an extra 6 shillings for each dependent child. And at that time, the average male wage was weekly wage was around 26 shillings. So it's actually less than the average male wage, but it was more than most women were earning. Most women were earning around 11 shillings if they were working. And over time, some commentators and politicians began to think that that's too generous for war widows, and they tended to kind of crack down on it, and it became quite highly taxed. At one point, it was taxed at 50%, the widows' pensions, and it could also be withdrawn if people's behaviour wasn't seen to be up to standard. If their moral behaviour wasn't up to standard, there were local committees who oversaw the pension being given out to people. So while it was it's generous in some ways, it could also be precarious, and family oral histories tend to suggest that for women with maybe 2 or 3 children, that was actually pretty difficult to live on. So I think it's sometimes worth kind of balancing out our sort of assumption of how well people are doing at that time. Just because they're receiving a regular income, they may still be struggling. And we can see there's a big variation in people's living conditions as well, and the degrees of overcrowding.
Thank you so much for that. There's a question about the event in St Leonard's on Saturday. I can share a poster and information with you all by email if you wish after this. But it's being hosted by Strikerlight with Lucy Daish, who I said has worked with Find My Past and is delivering our sessions in Hastings and St Leonard's, and also Lorna Crabb, who's a Hastings-based artist. And she is going to sort of create. Oh, thank you so much for that, Diana. She's going to create a sort of creative response to some of the findings from this aspect of the project. So the details are just here on the right-hand side of the poster. The open day drop-in, it's 10:30 till 12:30 at the Southwater Centre, which is a fully accessible centre. And there'll be sort of tea and biscuits, and that's free. So you're very welcome to do that, and also the other drop-in sessions as well. But the open day drop-in will have a couple of different people there, and it will be more broadly looking at aspects of the 1921 census. So you're very welcome to go. There's no sort of registration needed, although if you wanted to let us know, that would be useful, only because there's someone who's going who's allergic to perfume, quite severely allergic to perfume. So we've just been having to send out reminders every week before the sessions at the Southwater Centre just not to wear perfume. So perhaps if you're planning to go, let me know so I can just remind you not to wear anything like that. Thank you, Anna. Anna says she'll come along, but no perfume. Fantastic. That's much appreciated. That's great. So we've got just about 5 minutes left. If anyone's got any sort of final thoughts or questions or anything like that, we're very happy to sort of have anything. Or if you wanted to know anything more about other aspects of the project, as I said, we're running this until the end of July. We've got Dr Diana Wilkins is giving another talk, another webinar on the suffragettes, trailblazers and war widows on the 22nd of June, which is Wednesday. Again, that's 10 to 12. And a final one exploring Sussex through the lens of the 1921 census. And that's Friday, the 15th of July, also 10 to 12. We've got our sessions in Hastings, and we've got our Disability Heritage event for Disability History Month at Jubilee Library in Brighton, and that's on the 1st of July. And then we're also with the University of Brighton looking at further funding to develop this, because one of the things that we've found from talking to the National Archives is that the 1921 census will be free to search at some point, but they can't yet tell us when that will be. So if you go to the National Archives in person, you can search it for free. There's 2 other venues, one in Manchester and one in Wales, where you can also search it for free. But at some point in the future, maybe later this year or next year, it will be free, and you won't have to pay sort of £2.50 or £3.50 to download each of the resources, which is going to be great. But I think at the moment this is Find My Past way of clawing back the huge expense of digitising 38 million census returns. So I think it's sort of understandable for them as a sort of business, really. And the other thing, just to let you know quickly, is that the National Archives is delivering a free talk on the 14th of July, all about the 1921 census. Sorry, 14th of June, I should say, which is a rescheduled event. They were due to have it in, I think, sort of May, but that was postponed. We've got Dr. Deborah Sugg, who's maybe you've seen her on the telly. She's a kind of noted historian. And so that is on, and I can post a link to that in a second. You can register for that, that's free. So I'm really happy to do that, and I think that will be a really interesting talk to go along to online. And Alice is saying at West Sussex Records Office, we've been advised, or hopefully, fingers crossed, get free access via institutional accounts by the end of the year. That's absolutely fantastic to hear. I'm sure everyone will be really pleased to know that. And you know, for those of you who haven't been to West Sussex Records Office, it's in Chichester, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the first purpose-built archive in the country. I think that's correct. And it's just a fantastic sort of space, very light and airy and very helpful staff. So, you know, that's would be a good place to sort of pop along to, or the Keep if that's closer to you in the sort of Brighton area. So let me just find this link for the Talk Amongst Yourselves while I just have a little look and see if I can find the link for the National Archives event.
I also see, Nicola, that Irene has put in the chat to us that her paternal great uncle served in the First World War. I don't know, Irene, whether you'd like to say some more about that?
Yes, I will. The family lived at 102 Kings Road, Brighton. The family name was Assenheim. My great-grandparents were Lear and Joseph Assenheim, who were ice cream manufacturers, and they had homes both in Brighton and London. The house now actually is the Empress Suite of the Grand Hotel in Brighton. That's where the house stood. And their son, Philip, volunteered in the First World War. He was sadly killed at age 20 in October 1917 at the Battle of Passchendaele. He attended Shoreham College, and there's a memorial stone in Meadowview Cemetery in Brighton at the base of my great-grandmother's stone, because he was actually blown to pieces, so there were no remains. But there is a memorial stone to him there. And also there's one in Buffs Road Cemetery, which is the War Graves Memorial in Belgium. Although his name was Philip Assenheim, he actually, when he signed up, used another family name of Hart, because he thought Assenheim sounded very Germanic. and was a bit concerned about using such a name. So his records are under the name of Hart. They were quite difficult to find. I didn't realize that when I started researching. I'm wondering if he is actually on the roll of honour that my late husband's family erected at Middle Street Shore. I don't know if his name's actually on there, but I know that many of the family were married there.
Might be able to see that. Let's have a look.
His name's on the War Memorial at the Old Steine in Brighton and also in Shoreham College.
That's a fantastic heritage to have, to be able to, you know, sort of know all about him, and that sort of, you know, access the Shoreham College one. It's the Shoreham College monument. Is it publicly accessible? Do you know?
I think so. I think it's just in the main hallway.
Yeah, that's great.
Also, the Imperial War Museum has a War Memorials Register, and you can search on that to see for names and to see where they appear. I'm just trying to see if I can see. It's not terribly clear.
It might be under Hart, H-A-R-T,
yes.
or Assenheim, A-S-S-E-N-H-E-I-M.
It doesn't. I can't quite see it on there, but I can easily have a look and afterwards and let you know.
Thank you.
The other place for this sort of material is the We Were There Too website, and it's they do look for contributions from family members. So if you are interested in putting that material on there, that's perfectly possible. And of course, the Book of Honour is another place that you can just search online and see if your relative appears there. And I think that kind of anti-German sentiment that you referred to was very much a feature of the First World War period, and we certainly came across that in the Shalom Sussex project. There was a mayor in Bexhill that decided to stand down because of his German roots. The Messel family were subject to anti-German feeling, and there were riots in London as well. And also sometimes people were targeted because mobs didn't know the difference between a German name and a Russian name or a Polish name. So that certainly was a feature of that period, and it is one of the reasons I think that people changed their names to something less Germanic sounding.
Yeah, we think the family came over from Assenheim in Germany around about 1600 via Holland. So some of the family were in Holland, tracing back to Holland, and then came to the UK.
That's really interesting. Have you been to Kew to look at things like for the naturalization certificate, or looked on the National Archives site to see if it's on there?
No, I haven't.
Again, that's something that's quite, you can do, at least you can do a search from on a computer for that to see if it's there. It obviously it's a bit more of a trek up there to go and get it if you're interested, but yeah, that's another route to look into your family.
Thank you.
It's really interesting.
So I should just wrap it up really, because we're just coming to just over 12 o'clock. But I just wanted to say thank you everyone for coming today. I know we had a lot of people who registered because although they couldn't make it, they want to get a copy of the recording. So but I know, you know, it's been a really interesting and sort of explorative journey. So I just want to say thank you very much to Diana for her time today, because there's a lot of research that's gone into this, and we're really pleased to have her facilitate this. And also thank you to all for making the time to come today. And as I said, we will email you all with further information about the links on this webinar and the video when it goes up, as well as other events that we'll be hosting this month and next month as well. So do feel free to come along and We'd love to hear from you. If you've got any ideas or thoughts about the project, then do get in touch. And you can do so through the contact form on the Strike a Light website link, which I posted earlier today. So yes, thank you everyone for coming, and we hope to see you at one of our webinars in next month or this month if you're free. Take care then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I'll just get you all to log out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would you like to stay on for 5 minutes or so, Diana, afterwards?
Sure.
Okay, I'm just going to stop recording now.